There's a lot of things you should do when driving for Uber and Lyft, and a lot of things you shouldn't do when driving for Uber and Lyft. So in this video, I'm gonna talk about the 5 biggest do's and don'ts for drivers. Starting off with the do's, make sure you sign up with both apps. I've mentioned this maybe 10 or 15 times in other videos, but this is one of the biggest and best ways to make the most amount of money. And I know every city and state is different. For a lot of cities, they say Lyft is more popular or Uber is more popular. I know some drivers who say, you know what, I love Uber, I hate Lyft, or vice versa. At the end of the day, you're gonna make the most amount of money having both apps, mainly because if you think about it, you can get the best bonus structures from them. You can determine which one is paying the most. Sometimes even on a random Friday night, Uber might pay more for the first couple hours, and then Lyft will start paying more. It can go back and forth randomly. Make sure you sign up with both apps. Number 2, check the events. Now, as everybody knows, when it comes to the best times to drive for Uber and Lyft, morning and evening commutes, Friday and Saturday nights. That's kind of the biggest staple when it comes to making the most amount of money. However, one of the most underrated times is driving during events. I remember I first experienced this in Boston. There are a bunch of schools and universities in Boston, and on Tuesday during the day and Wednesday during the day, it was graduation time, and the surges were off the charts. However, not a lot of drivers were on the road because, as you can imagine, that's really like an off-peak hour time to drive, and I was there making a ton of money. So even if it's like, say, a random Wednesday night, but Lady Gaga's performing, or there's a crazy big basketball game going on, or if you're in Vegas and there's a big fight happening, whatever the case is, those events are some of the best times to drive where the peaks are the highest. Number 3, track your expenses. Now I want to stress, I'm a former accountant, but I'm not your accountant. Always like to say that, but make sure you track all your expenses. In case you don't know, when you are a rideshare driver, you're an independent contractor. I will say, as a side note, this does vary and it's changing over time. In some cases, you're an employee. In other cases, you might be an independent contractor. But typically, you are going to be an independent contractor, which means when tax season rolls around, you actually have to pay those taxes as opposed to them being taken out of your paycheck. And one big way to mitigate the amount that you're paying is doing what's called write-offs. The biggest thing is to look at what is the ordinary and necessary course of my business. Oversimplifying this, any single time you buy something when it comes to driving, you can typically write that off. Oil changes, the miles that you drive, if let's say you buy a few items when you're driving, any kind of maintenance on your car, your cell phone plan, there are a lot of different types of write-offs you can do, and this allows you to pay the least amount on your taxes because you can write it off. And I will say, as a side note, also hire a tax accountant. Now, if you're driving part-time, this isn't as big of a deal, but especially if you're driving full-time, you need a tax accountant. Those write-offs are gonna be super, super high. And especially if, let's say, Uber and Lyft is your primary source of income or your only source of income, write-offs and tax accounting is gonna be a lot more tricky than a normal job, so keep that in mind. Number 4, the big 4. And for my accountants out there, for maybe the 5 people that know what I'm talking about, I'm not talking about the big 4 accounting firms. I'm talking about the 4 things you absolutely need in your car. Now, I will say, as a side note, things like gum, mints, candy, snacks, water, yeah, it doesn't hurt necessarily, but I'm gonna be honest, especially in this day and age, no one's really expecting it. Back in the day when Uber and Lyft first started out, you did kind of have to have those goodies, so to speak, in your car. Now you don't really need them, but you definitely need these 4. Phone mount, charger, aux cord, and dash cam. Here's the reason why. First off, with a phone mount, you want to make sure your phone is mounted, hence the name, and it's a lot safer to have it mounted and be able to control it than doing this thing. I'm still in shock, and I've mentioned this in other videos when I see drivers who I talk to and they're like, oh yeah, I've been driving for 6 months, and they still have their phone here, and they're doing like this thing when driving. 1, that's just annoying, but 2, it's super unsafe. And 3, phone mounts are super cheap. You can get one on Amazon for $15. I do have a link listed below to those items I mentioned, but you could even go to the dollar store and get one for $1. The second item, you definitely need a phone charger. I do suggest maybe getting like a couple in case someone wants to charge their phone in your car. You could always pass yours to theirs, but definitely at least have one, because as you can imagine, if you're running Uber and Lyft and maybe like Pandora or Spotify for music, any podcast app, any GPS, and all the other apps on your phone, that's gonna eat at your battery super quick. Make sure you have a charger. When it comes to an aux cord, I think it's super helpful, especially on Friday and Saturday nights when people want to play music as they're going out to bars, clubs, their friend's place, whatever. And I will say, if you do happen to have an iPhone, having that small iPhone attachment, which is still super annoying, can be helpful. So I will say that. And I know that a lot of cars now do have Bluetooth enabled where you can easily connect a phone, but it's gonna add a lot more time onto the ride because you typically have to pull over. You can't do it when you're driving for safety reasons. So you pull over, you try to connect Bluetooth. I don't know why, but Bluetooth, even for me as a musician, it still just never works. I don't know why. Bluetooth is still super annoying sometimes. Having that aux cord is super simple to plug it into your car, plug it into the person's phone, you're good to go. And lastly, and this may be the most important one, when it comes to a dash cam, have it. Now, most dash cams, especially good ones, can film both the outside and the inside of your car at the same time. And this is important. It kind of stinks to say, but statistically speaking, the more you're on the road, the more likely you are to get in an accident. And statistically speaking, the more you're driving, the more likely something is to happen inside your vehicle, whether it is a minor incident or a minor disagreement to a major one. And having that footage, having that proof, Murphy's Lawing it just in case something happens, you have evidence to show your side of the story. And number 5, study the bonus structures. I get asked a lot, what is the best way to make the most amount of money? And this is easily at the top of the list. Now, every city, state, and area has its kind of own specifics when it comes to the actual bonus structures. Make sure you study them as much as possible. I was talking to my brother, who's right now driving for Lyft in Denver, and Denver is a great city when it comes to bonuses. And he was telling me that the difference between making 20 to 25 an hour or 40 to 50 an hour is the bonuses. I was in Austin, Texas earlier this year for South by Southwest talking to a driver who's making 6 figures, driving for Uber, who's making 6 figures. And I asked him, like, hey, if you had to pick like a couple things, how do you make 6 figures driving for Uber besides just working a lot? But like, are there any tricks you use? You know, I'm just kind of curious. And he said, honestly, the bonuses. I make sure to study the bonuses. I look at the bonuses as much as possible. I hit all the metrics I want. I hit all the tiers or whatever. That's where I make that amount of money. Now going on to the don'ts. Number 1, don't just drive randomly. There's a couple things I mean by this, but one is for a lot of beginner drivers, you just start driving and you're like, oh, I'm just gonna drive whenever. Of course, you know about the morning and evening commutes, the Friday and Saturday nights, but the problem is if you drive in non-peak hours, you're not really gonna make that much money. This is why I always suggest make sure you track your analytics. I did a video talking about the number 1 way to make the most amount of money, and the biggest thing is to track your analytics. For example, and I mentioned this in other videos, I like to drive during the pregame hours. What I mean is driving during the period of time before people are going crazy on a Friday and Saturday night, but people are still going out to their friend's place. So I'm talking about like 5 p.m. to maybe 7 or 8 p.m. Now, I would not know that had I not studied the analytics. So make sure you look at the best times to drive when it comes to both Uber and Lyft. Another thing I'm going to suggest on top of this is have a quota. One of the best parts about Uber and Lyft is you are your own boss. However, on the negative side, you are your own boss. If you don't drive that much, no one's going to penalize you. No one's going to come after you or anything. So a big thing I suggest is don't just drive aimlessly, not when it comes to when you drive, but also how you drive. Set a quota maybe every day, every week, however you want to do it. I know some drivers who do it by rides. They say, look, I want to do X amount of rides. Whenever those rides are done, that's it. Or they do it by money, or they do it by hours. So for example, they might say, hey, once I make, I don't know, $700 in this week, I'm done driving. Other drivers might say, hey, I'm going to drive 40 hours this week. Whenever I get to 40, then I'm done driving. Having a quota, as weird as it is to say, helps keep you in check. Number 2, don't avoid rideshare insurance. This is huge. Make sure you get it. It isn't that much on top of your regular insurance, which, by the way, you should have because there's a lot of incidents where, let's say you're driving, you don't have rideshare insurance. God forbid you get into an accident. Like I mentioned earlier, it's statistics. You get into an accident, you call your insurance company up, and you're like, hey, yeah, I was driving for Uber, and then this and this happened. And they're like, whoa. We didn't know you were driving for Uber. We're not gonna cover you. We didn't know you were a rideshare driver. We're not gonna cover this. And unfortunately, and probably not surprisingly, insurance companies will use any excuse they can to not cover you or to partially cover you. So a big thing I highly suggest, I know a lot of drivers sometimes skip over this, make sure you get rideshare insurance. Number 3, don't let your car get dirty and smelly. Now I know, this is almost like being a person 101, but this is a big thing so many drivers overlook, especially when it comes to smells and the way something looks. It's very easy to get accustomed to your own car and just not even notice it or not even think about it. But when it comes to ratings, getting tips, and the overall rider experience, as you can imagine, their first impression is how the outside of your car looks. Now, when I was in Boston and it rained a lot and everything, I didn't really have to worry about that too much. Here in LA, it barely ever rains, so I have to worry about the outside of my car a lot more. Of course, getting things like car washes, etc., etc. In addition, it's not just the outside of your car, but the inside as well. As you pull up, even if your car looks spotless on the outside, when someone opens up that door, if there's a weird smell that gets thrown in their face, or they sit in your car and there's this weird musk kind of simmering, not the best situation to be in, and that's going to be a bad experience for a rider. I know this is one that a lot of drivers are like, oh yeah, don't worry, my car's clean, my car smells great. But does it? Number 4, don't use the Uber GPS. Pretty straightforward, especially for a lot of beginner drivers. Most drivers I find signed up with Uber first and then Lyft, and that makes sense. Uber is significantly more popular than Lyft, and a lot of drivers just stay within the app. So when they go to pick somebody up, they're just using the Uber GPS. Don't do that. Use something like Google Maps. It is way better. You're gonna have a way easier time getting to your destination, and you'll get there quicker. And number 5, don't forget about delivery driving. Now, I already did a huge in-depth video talking about Uber versus Uber Eats, or essentially rideshare driving versus delivery driving. I have a link listed below it in the description. But the reason why I mention this is there's been a lot of studies and surveys to find that in some areas, Uber pays more than Uber Eats. But in other areas, Uber Eats pays more than Uber. And let's be honest, you're watching this video because you want to make money. And you don't just want to make money, you want to make more money. And I feel like for a lot of drivers, they start driving for Uber and Lyft, they're hitting the bonuses, they're trying to make as much money as possible, and they don't really think about delivery driving. Definitely test it out, test out the waters. It is different city to city, state to state, like I said, depending on the area and maybe even depending on the night, but keep in mind that you can do both as well. Maybe on a Friday night in your area, Uber Eats pays way more, but on a Thursday night, maybe Uber pays more. This is why I always suggest track your analytics, look at everything. This is a huge way to make a lot of money. And now a bonus do and don't, starting off with what you should do, and that is get AAA. I want to stress I have zero affiliation with AAA. I've talked about them a lot though. The reason why is it's unbelievably important for pretty much every driver out there. Even if you're not driving for Uber and Lyft, you should have AAA. Even when I wasn't driving for Uber and Lyft, I had AAA. I got it as a Christmas present from my dad every year. And when I was younger, I was like, I don't get it. Why is this a Christmas present for AAA? I don't get it. But then as I got older and I used it, I'm like, wow, AAA is truly one of the best services you can have for driving, and it is super cheap in comparison to what you get. Not even just when it comes to driving and roadside assistance, but also for things like discounts on hotels, airfare, random restaurants, and so much more. And now, talking about the bonus don't, make sure you don't ignore both apps. I want to come back to the beginning of this video talking about signing up with both apps, because when I say this, a lot of drivers are like, yeah, I've signed up with both, but Lyft pays more. And I'm like, okay, well, when's the last time you drove for Uber? And they're like, well, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 months ago. No. Make sure you always go back and forth between each app, maybe almost every week. Test out both. In case you didn't know, Lyft has its own bonuses, so does an Uber. So like say you drive for Lyft, you get all those bonuses and you're hitting those metrics that they want, then go to Uber and get all those bonuses from Uber. I've talked about this before in other videos, but I remember in Boston, this was like years ago, but it was during St. Patty's Day, I got a text from Lyft saying, hey, minimum $25 an hour guaranteed. And then I got a text from Uber saying, hey, minimum $30 an hour guaranteed. Then Lyft texted me back and said, you know what, we changed our mind. We're gonna bump it up to a $35 an hour guarantee. And they were actually in a bidding war to try to get drivers on the road. I believe it was Uber who won that bidding war. It was either $40 or $45 an hour minimum hourly guarantee. And guess who wins in that bidding war? You. Make sure you not only sign up with both apps, but you constantly check them, and that's a great way to make the most amount of money.